92 to 95 FM, 810 medium wave, and on digital radio, BBC Radio Scotland.
It's 7 o'clock on Wednesday the 25th of March. You're listening to Good Morning Scotland with Gary Robertson and Hayley Millar. Coming up in the next hour.
After a 6-year wait, the Penrose report into contaminated blood supplies will be published.
We just want the truth here. Why was this done? Why was this blood not screened?
All to come, let's start with a summary of the BBC News. The findings of a long-awaited Scottish inquiry into the contamination of the blood supply in the 70s and 80s will be published later this morning. Thousands of people were infected with hepatitis C and HIV through blood transfusions and blood products. Our health correspondent Eleanor Bradford reports.
It's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, yet this is the first time an inquiry has been held with the power to force witnesses to give evidence. Between 1970 and 1991, thousands of people were infected with hepatitis C and HIV through NHS blood products. The true number of victims is not known. This inquiry, led by a former High Court judge, has taken 6 years and cost around £12 million. Lord Penrose's 1,800-page report can only examine what happened in Scotland, but will look at what was done to protect people from infection and whether they were properly tested, given clinical understanding at the time. Lord Penrose will not be present to outline his findings, as he is seriously ill in hospital.
92 to 95 FM, 810 medium wave, and on digital radio, BBC Radio Scotland.
It's 8 o'clock. You're listening to Good Morning Scotland with Gary Robertson and Hayley Millar. And still to come,
families await the findings of an inquiry into contaminated NHS blood products.
There could be thousands out there that still don't know, and I think they should be doing their best to try and contact everybody that was given bloods, and hopefully it's not too late for others like it was my dad.
The time is 8 minutes past 8, and this is Wednesday's Good Morning Scotland. So more on our main news this morning. The long-awaited findings of a Scottish inquiry into the contamination of NHS blood products in the 70s and 80s will be published later this morning. Thousands of people across the UK were infected with hepatitis C and HIV, and around 2,000 people have died. Yet no one has ever been held to account, and until the Penrose Inquiry, there had never been a statutory investigation into what had happened. Well, Gill Fife was contaminated with hepatitis C after undergoing a blood transfusion during childbirth in 1988. She's recently published a memoir called Life Blood, and Jill joins us now from our Edinburgh studio. Jill, good morning to you.
Good morning.
What are your feelings? This is a day I presume you've been waiting for a very long time.
Yes, it's a very important day, I think, not just for transfusion victims, because it's the Penrose Inquiry is about accountability, and if it means in the future that mistakes such as these ones, and I think from the research I did from the book, it's clear that Britain lagged behind in its response to this problem and therefore exacerbated it. And if in the future, when problems arise and mistakes are made, they can be acknowledged faster, I think that will be a very important thing for everyone.
Well, your involvement in the story goes back as far as 1988, as I mentioned, that blood transfusion. But how long was it before you realised there was a problem?
Well, the difficulty with hepatitis C is that for the first 10 years after infection, the only symptom is what is called unreasonable fatigue, and that's very difficult to describe to other people. And so I didn't realise that I was ill until a letter arrived from the blood transfusion service 7 years after I was infected.
And what was your reaction to getting a letter with such devastating news?
It was, well, I knew at once that I was. The letter recommended that I seek a test because the donor had been found to be infected, and I knew at once that I was infected. I'd been so tired. I had struggled to hold down teaching posts, and on one occasion, I'd fallen asleep I fell asleep all the time. When I'd get home from work, I'd fall asleep, and they'd have to waken me up to go to bed. And on one occasion, I fell asleep at the wheel of my car and wrote it off. So when I received the letter, I immediately thought, I'm infected. My husband was a little slower to we had a rational conversation as I convinced him, no, this must be right and you could be infected. And he then said, no, I'm not, because I'm not exhausted. And you could see him realising that I probably was. But at that point, it suddenly dawned on me that the children could be infected, and I just absolutely lost it. I was screaming and panicking until we got medical help and they were tested and found to be clear.
And during that time, before you received that letter, I think you said it was 7 years of this fatigue and feeling unwell. Did anybody in the medical profession ever ask you about a blood transfusion? Did anybody ever put two and two together and think that you might have hepatitis C?
No, they didn't. Although I felt... People would say to me, oh, you've got two young children. Tiredness is so difficult to quantify and to describe. And so I felt ashamed. I felt I wasn't coping. But I had tried to resist the transfusion at the time. Well, what I wanted to know was, do I really need this? Because I knew, because of the AIDS scare in the 80s, that there must be some negligible risk. And
your phone.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, we just
that.
switched that off. That's fine. No problem at all.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I knew that when the doctors assured me that the blood was safe, because I come from a sort of sciencey family, I knew that meant there was a negligible risk.
So you had asked that question and had a reassurance at the time?
Yes, I was told the blood was safe. I'm so sorry.
No, it's quite all right. No problem at all. I realise sometimes these things are...
Yeah, so...
That's fine.
Sorry.
Hopefully that's it dealt with.
Hopefully that's it, yep.
And what do you hope now, as the result of this Penrose Inquiry happens? Do you want a finger of blame to be pointed? Do you think compensation should be awarded? Where should these findings take us? I
think there are thousands of people there are now thought to be 30,000 people infected, so there are thousands of people in desperate need. The reason I wrote Lifeblood is because I'm actually one of the lucky ones. I was traced, I was eventually cured. I now have autoimmune disease, which we suspect is a side effect of the treatment with alpha interferon, but I don't have hepatitis. And I have had huge support from my family. As soon as we discovered I was infected, we told the children straight away. They were only 7 and 10 at that point. And after that, every decision became a family decision. Our lives took a very different course because we lost my income, I had lost my health. And so we made decisions and did things we would never have done. And that's what I wrote the memoir about, to celebrate the courage of my family. So personally, I would like accountability, because it will mean that, we all make mistakes, but the problem arises when mistakes are not dealt with fast enough. Having said that, I know I'm very lucky. I've got a very supportive family. I know that thousands of people desperately need help now, and they haven't had it.
And are you satisfied with the way this inquiry has been carried out? Because I know some people have expressed concerns that it is a statutory investigation in Scotland, so that means that people in Scotland could be compelled to give evidence. But of course, many of the decisions were taken they were all taken pre-devolution, but at a time when obviously it was ministers and others south of the border who were making some decisions for the Scottish Health Service. So is there the danger that many of those who are accountable will actually be left out of this?
Oh, I think that from my understanding, that's exactly what will happen. However, I have been... I think this week the Penrose Inquiry seemed to be so important, and the reaction all over the UK is, I think, very encouraging. I think, although it is a Scottish inquiry, and to Scotland's lasting credit that it has held a public inquiry, I think it will have far-reaching consequences and will have an effect all over the UK. Okay. I think it's now too important to ignore.
Gill Fife, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us this morning. 8:15.
Thank you.
Well, listening to that is Pat McQuire, who's a solicitor with Thompson's, who represent many people affected with contaminated blood. Good morning to you, Pat.
Good morning.
Just remind us then of the background to the Penrose Inquiry and how we've got to this stage today.
Well, today is the culmination of more than 2 decades of campaigning by the victims of the contaminated blood scandal. But the crucial step for them was when the SNP government came into power in 2007. And of course, one of the first things our now First Minister Nicola Sturgeon did when she was a Cabinet Secretary for Health at that time was put in motion the wheels for this public inquiry to take place. And that's so important to remember, because I think it's entirely fair to say that there's not one victim of this scandal who believes that the Penrose Inquiry is an end in itself. The Penrose Inquiry is one, albeit extremely important, step towards their ultimate goal. It's a goal that you describe as justice, and it's a goal that neither Lord Penrose nor any public inquiry could deliver. It's one that only the Scottish Government can deliver. And because of the amount of help, the staunch friend that Nicola Sturgeon has been to the victims in the past, they progress today with a great deal of hope that she'll continue to do the right thing and to deliver that justice for them.
And, I mean, in what form does that justice take then?
Justice comes down to two very simple things, and two things that Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government can certainly do. It firstly means a clear and unambiguous apology, and it secondly means financial redress that recognises properly and fully the terrible suffering that every victim has gone through. And in that context, of course, I think it's extremely important to remember here that the victims are not just those who were infected at the hands of the NHS, it's also their families who were forced to watch them suffer and to watch far too many members of their family die. And at the moment, I'm afraid to say, well, it's been referred to by a few people in various news outlets, there is some financial support available. It's woefully inadequate when placed against the amount of suffering that all the families have gone through. And it actually is completely a pale imitation of what exists in the Republic of Ireland, where there is a full compensation scheme set up by the government that's assessed in the way the courts assess damages. That's what the victims need, and that's today what they look to our First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to deliver. So
do you think that that process might happen or could happen regardless of what's in the Penrose Inquiry today? Because the suggestion is it might not answer every question that the victims want answers to, particularly as we were just talking about there, that a lot of the it came down to ministerial decisions, taken at Westminster at the time. So it might not have a wide enough remit to actually answer all those questions.
Today I'm not talking about questions or what may or may not be in the Penrose Inquiry. That will happen when it's published at 11 o'clock. My call today is one that's firmly within the grasp of the Scottish Parliament, because health is a devolved matter. And no matter what happens today, we all know that the Scottish Government have the budget for health, and therefore they can respond to the calls of the victims and actually the calls of every Scottish citizen who believes that it's the right thing. These people were forced to suffer at the hands of the conduct and omissions of the NHS, and therefore it's only right and proper that they're fully compensated. And what happens here is already happening in the Republic of Ireland.
I think three men, are taking legal action in England, but no one's ever certainly been compensated here. Regardless of the outcome today, is this something that certainly some of the victims and families that you represent, will we see legal action being taken?
I sincerely hope, and every one of the victims sincerely hope, that legal action won't be necessary, because all that we need is the Scottish Government to announce a compensation scheme. That's a matter entirely for Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, who has been, as I've said, the staunchest supporter of every victim to now, and that's why today we expect her to act in exactly that direction.
And it's incredible to think the length of time that there's been, between people, I suppose, having been given these blood products and transfusions, and the length of time it's taken for them to be diagnosed. And I suppose it's really, in terms of the number of people affected, there's dispute really about just how many are involved, because you might not even know of everyone at this point in time.
These are things I think that will become clearer today, we hope, when Lord Penrose's report is published. But what we can say for sure is that at the moment, nobody absolutely knows how many people have been affected, and we know that far too many Scottish people are walking about in ignorance with a potentially deadly disease inside their bodies that was caused by the NHS, and they simply don't know that fact. It's terrible.
Pat McQuire, thank you very much for speaking to us this morning. He's from Thompson's a law firm which represents many of the people affected with the contaminated blood